Steve, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to sit with me and converse, dialogue. So you're an integral philosopher, author of 3 books, including the new one, The Presence of the Infinite, a proponent of an evolutionary worldview, an activist for change. So before we delve into that and your work, I'd just like to ask you, from a personal standpoint, your own life journey to where you are at the present point.
Sure. Well, first let me just say it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks a lot for doing this series.
Oh.
It's really, I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you.
I was raised in Los Angeles, and I was born in 1960. So by the time I was about 11 years old, I felt like there was this renaissance going on, and I was too young to participate in it. You know, I wanted to be a hippie, but I was too young. And at the tail end of the 60s, in the early 70s, part of what became of the momentum of the youth movement was channeled into the birth of, for lack of a better term, progressive spirituality, right? Alternative spirituality. Those who had been part of the 60s knew that there was a spiritual component to the universe, but they were looking for spirituality in places other than in the establishment of, Judeo-Christian Western civilization. Mm-hmm. So I was really drawn to progressive spirituality and started reading all the books around at the time, and felt as though this was really where my life was calling me, to be a participant in this emergence. And throughout the 70s, I continued to be involved and participate in progressive culture, not just through reading, but practices, and I was a member of various communities in Southern California. But then, by the time I was 19 in 1979, I realized that I wanted to make a contribution, but that I couldn't do it just as merely a counterculturalist. I didn't just want to be a hippie for the rest of my life. I realized that I needed establishment credentials. So I went to business school for entrepreneurship, and that sort of showed me that I needed a graduate degree of some kind. I didn't want to get a PhD because I didn't want to go on the academic track. I didn't want to study more business. So law seemed like a really nice thing that was academically interesting. It was philosophical, it was robust, but it also had lots of real-world applications, even though I never planned to be a lawyer long term. I went to law school at the University of Virginia and learned a lot there. In some ways, this notion of wanting to be part of a renaissance, I could see that, for example, Charlottesville, Virginia, where Jefferson had founded the University of Virginia, it was kind of an extinct volcano of paradigm-shifting energy, right? So then I moved to San Francisco after law school and reestablished my connections to the progressive spiritual community in San Francisco. And then I had an opportunity to move to Boulder, Colorado to do a startup company, an environmentally friendly household cleaning product company. Did that. But then around 1994, I had kind of an awakening where I realized that all this preparation that I had been doing since my youth, that the future had arrived and that it was really time to begin participating in what, at least in the 90s, in 94, seemed like the emergence of a spiritual renaissance. In Boulder, Colorado, where I was living, this progressive spiritual community was really in a florescent period, as it was in many other parts of the country as well. So I wanted to intuit the art movement that I felt that would be part of this emerging spiritual renaissance. I had seen whether going all the way back to the Renaissance of Europe, but every major period of cultural emergence had significant art that was a part of it, and certainly the 60s could be counted as that. So in the 90s, I wanted to anticipate the tenets of the new art movement, the spiritual Renaissance art movement that seemed to be promising to emerge. So I started a company called Now and Zen with the idea that we would create, the tagline of the company was cultural artifacts of the spiritual renaissance. And we made a product which I created called the Zen alarm clock, which had tremendous legs. We sold over 500,000 of them.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
But it's still, by the late 90s, I realized that the New Age, it was called at the time, that's now a term of derision, but progressive spirituality in the 90s, that wasn't going to deliver the societal transformation that we had all hoped for, although it was still a beautiful, vibrant culture in its own way. And it was around that time, in 99, that I was drawn into the integral philosophy movement. And there were a variety of synchronicities that occurred around that time, 99, 2000, that brought me into the movement. And I knew at that moment that this was the spiritual renaissance. This was the emergent new form of culture that I had been yearning for since I was 12 years old. And so since 2000, integral philosophy, or this evolutionary perspective, has been the primary focus of my working life. I've written 3 books on the subject, and now founded a think tank, co-founded it, that is applying this perspective on the evolution of consciousness to politics and to creating forward movement in American culture wherever possible. So, I could go on, but that's something on my background.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of progression along all your work, your thinking, and have there been people who have influenced you along the way?
Well, certainly. In the 80s, I was particularly influenced by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, right, the Jesuit scientist philosopher, who, in my 2007 book, Integral Consciousness, I herald as one of the major founders of this integral or evolutionary perspective. And Teilhard spoke to me very deeply. He was somebody that moved me quite a bit. Then in the 90s, Alfred North Whitehead was a philosopher who I was very much drawn to and delved deeply into his work, as well as his interpreters such as Charles Hartshorne, and there was a rich vein of spiritual philosophical thinking that I appreciated there. Then in around 2000, I had resisted Ken Wilber's work, but when he began to incorporate spiral dynamics into his thinking, and when this recognition of postmodernism, as it's known in the integral perspective, or the cultural creative worldview, as was first described by Paul Ray, this framing of this countercultural worldview that I had been part of for 30 years, and contrasting it with the modernist worldview and the traditional worldview before it, and really pointing to something that would transcend and include countercultural postmodernism. That was the big breakthrough that I think really began the integral movement that is still continuing to grow and flourish today. So Ken Wilber I can certainly cite as a significant influence, among many other spiritual teachers and authors.
Yeah, so you were drawn to these evolutionary thinkers with your introduction to Teilhard de Chardin in the 80s. Did you even, so something within you attracted you to that, right?
Sure. Well, like I said, I had been identified with and loyal to progressive spirituality, right? So I had read all kinds of different progressive spiritual authors. And the part about progressive spirituality that I was most interested in was the areas in where science and spirituality seemed to be confirming each other or overlapping, right? I remember in 1977 reading Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics and going to see a lecture of his at UCLA. And while I think we've gone beyond, Capra's work, I was very intrigued by the idea that esoteric contemplative practices could reveal scientific truths, and that scientific thought had spiritual truth inside of it. And that's especially been the case with the discovery of evolution, and now in the last few decades, this realization that the entire universe is subject to evolution, including human consciousness and culture. And that's really the focus of integral philosophy.
Yeah, so I want to delve into that more, but I just want to define the term that you've used a few times for anyone watching that's not sure, progressive spirituality. In the presence of the infinite, you talk about the different worldviews and the different religious, spiritual worldviews. So why don't you just, if you don't mind.
Right. Well, I mentioned a little bit that in the 70s, the significant demographic of people in the United States and elsewhere in the world who'd been attracted to the counterculture, who had pushed off against the limitations of the pathologies of the establishment, they had been turned on to the spiritual nature of the universe largely through psychedelics, right? And psychedelics had a huge effect on opening the spiritual eyes of a generation of truth seekers. And it was in the 70s that counterculturalists began rediscovering the wisdom of the East, earth-based spirituality, esoteric spirituality, all kinds of forms of spirituality that were not the mainstream form of religion that was in America at the time, but it was an alternative. But it was also a culture of welcoming pluralism. So 1,000 flowers could bloom within the context of progressive spirituality. All paths were welcome, none were really viewed as exclusive. And so in this eclectic mix of countercultural spirituality, This movement, now a worldwide movement, began to take shape, which redefined the sacred and rediscovered enchantment in the universe in a way that didn't involve going back to the history of religious spirituality that preceded it.
Yeah. And so you differentiate progressive spirituality from secular spirituality and religious.
Right. In the book, I talk about the Presence of the Infinite. My latest book is about evolutionary spirituality, which I compare and contrast to these other major forms, cultural forms. Religious spirituality, right? It has both highly sophisticated and mature elements, as well as fundamentalisms, right? So it's a family of spiritual views. Progressive spirituality, as I mentioned, includes magical thinking and lots of New Age stuff, but there's also a lot of very sophisticated teachers and practices within progressive spirituality. Secular spirituality is something that's been emerging. It's I would say all of those who are actively define themselves as non-believers, right? And that includes militant atheists, as well as some very sophisticated thinkers like Stuart Kaufman, who recognize in the creativity of nature that there's a kind of a sacred dimension to the universe, even while still identifying with the scientific worldview. So secular spirituality is, it defines people's identity and attracts their loyalty and sets itself up in competition with other forms of spirituality. So as I carefully argue in the book, the best way to understand it, to both appreciate it and to resist it, is to see it as a belief system.
Yeah. So I just want to backtrack again. You were very deeply influenced by the integral movement, but I would classify you as also an independent thinker, so that didn't seem to be, you decided to, leave the movement, but because you were part of the Integral Institute, because you felt, if this is safe to say, a need to go more independent. And,
sure.
And your first book, Integral Consciousness, you wanted to look at the integral movement also.
Yeah, I was invited to join Ken Wilber's Integral Institute when it was in its emergent phase in 2000. I was originally asked to be part of the art branch. Later I became part of the business branch because of experiences in both those areas. But after a couple of years working within the Integral Institute, I realized that I had a contribution to make, but that I needed to best make it as an independent voice. So Ken Wilber and I parted on good terms in 2002, and I began work on this book, which took about 5 years to write. And I wanted the freedom to be able to offer constructive critiques to the integral movement. And integral is much bigger than Ken Wilber's philosophy. If it lives up to its promise, it really will be the next great phase of human history, a worldview that transcends and includes the best of what's come before. So I realized that I had a contribution to make to this emerging worldview. Like I said, I'd been sort of oriented toward it since I was 12, before I even knew what it was. And so since my first book came out in 2007, I've been an independent voice in the integral movement. I would still identify myself as part of the integral movement. I'm just not a Wilberian.
Yeah, and I think all of us need to be independent thinkers, so that's always the best way. Right. And take the best of what you learn and then move forward. And that's how evolution of ideas happen.
Sure, and whether it's the Enlightenment philosophy movement, I mean, if integral philosophy is to become a historically significant movement in human philosophy and spirituality, then proof of its potential will be found in a variety of voices within it, and not simply a singular philosophical line.
Right, yeah. And I think with the lineage of Descartes, Newton, we didn't stop there. The scientists, thinkers continued on. Einstein, the quantum scientists, the progressive scientists of the 20th century, and the Stuart Kaufmans, Santa Fe Institutes, and so on. So So as you say, in your own progression, you left the Integral Institute movement to be your own, to continue on, be an independent voice, and that led you to write your first book, Integral Consciousness, or Integral Consciousness in the Future of Evolution, and it had the subtitle, How the Integral Worldview is Transforming Politics, Culture, and Spirituality. So I'm wondering if you would say more about this book and the ideas that you presented there.
Sure. Well, the first half of the book, I designed it to be a accessible introduction to this integral way of seeing. That was more general and hopefully more widely agreeable than some of the other formulations of integral philosophy that had been out at the time. And so I described the tenets of integral philosophy as I came to know them, specifically what integral consciousness is, how it feels, how one practices it, what good is it in the world, what it can do that other forms of consciousness or other worldviews, value systems are not as good at. I talked about integral politics, how this integral perspective could transform politics and what kind of politics goes with this integral perspective. I took an initial stab at integral spirituality to describe that, again, in ways that were different from the main discourse that was going on within the integral movement at the time, but in ways that were greatly appreciated by many other integralists. They really appreciated having someone other than Ken Wilber describing this and making it accessible in ways that it hadn't been accessible before.
Yeah.
The second half of the book was my attempt to contribute to the corpus of integral philosophy, both by describing its intellectual history, right? The integral philosophy, as I describe it in my 2007 book, really begins with Georg Hegel and can trace its lineage through all the philosophers in the last 200 years who have recognized that the universe is in this process of becoming. And within this deep, profound fact of the becoming of the universe in nature, in culture, and even in self, that there's truths about reality that we have yet to discover, that evolution itself is a spiritual teaching. And so plumbing the depths of this, thinkers like Henri Bergson or Jean Gebser, or I mentioned Teilhard and Whitehead. These are all significant founders of integral philosophy. And as I mentioned in the book, Ken Wilber, beginning in the 90s, took these thinkers and integrated system science and developmental psychology to really unpack a very important element of integral philosophy that doesn't exist in these earlier thinkers. But integral philosophy has continued to evolve, and it's now an international intellectual community with lots of conferences and writers in all kinds of different fields. And so I'm really proud to be part of it.
Yeah, and I think you're such a forward thinker that you're, as you mentioned in your first book, Integral Consciousness, that you looked at also the political realm, because that's. We'll get there in just a little while.
Okay.
Your current work and how you're really trying to see, take it away from not just a philosophy, but a movement that can change society by changing the way we do business with each other.
Right.
So let's just continue the progression, because then you wrote your next book, Evolution's Purpose, an integral interpretation of the scientific story of our origins. So that was a very big undertaking. What made you decide to, and so it's a book that takes on scientific materialism and mythic thinking, and that tries to, or does, integrate science and spirituality. So what prompted you to write this book?
Sure. Well, most of the people who are interested in this integral perspective we're coming from the counterculture. In other words, this integral philosophy and this integral spiritual movement is emerging out of progressive spirituality, as we previously discussed it. And so the first book is really written for those who were interested in integral philosophy or had heard about it and wanted to know more about it. And so the primary the primary audience for integral consciousness was the cultural creatives, or the postmodernists, as we term them in integral parlance. And I knew that there were very important truths that this integral perspective was bringing that also needed to be translated for the mainstream, for modernists, and that the science of evolution really did contain unmistakable spiritual truths within it. So the book was, Evolution's Purpose was designed to reach out, or at least establish an integral beachhead, if you will, within modernist discourse, right? So if people were interested in integral philosophy, they could learn about how evolution can make a big difference in how thinking about evolution in terms of our own consciousness, in terms of our society, we can rehabilitate important ideas like progress, right? Progress with a capital P was sort of a Victorian notion that had all kinds of immature expressions, and ironically it was progress when many postmodernists said, well, that's a Eurocentric justification for colonialism to try to claim that we're progressing, but look at environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation, the exploitation of the developing world. All of these negative things pointed to modernism as being more regressive than progressive, right? Also, scientific materialism, the scientists of evolution, like, Richard Dawkins has made a big deal out of evolution, right? Thinking that the science of evolution disproves spirituality, or that it can be used as a weapon against spirituality. But as I argued in Evolution's Purpose, it's actually the science of evolution that demonstrates unmistakable progress. That is, evolution creates value. Nature has real value. It's not just a projection of humans. The universe has real value, and it starts with hydrogen gas, and we end, in this globalizing civilization where we're trying to make the world better through the beautiful, the true, and the good, however we may define those. So bringing out the more philosophical aspects, bringing forward thinkers like Whitehead, and adding to this integral corpus of philosophy by focusing on the spirituality that could be found within evolution in a way that was translated to modernists, in a way that was philosophically rigorous without being so academic that it would be unreadable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you also in the book talk about the spectrum of evolution beliefs, so you made sure that you differentiated for people like Dawkins, who would say that arguments like yours are just, cover up for intelligent design and stuff, that kind of thinking. You made sure that you differentiated what's wrong with intelligent design also.
Yeah, a big thinker who I had been significantly influenced by in Evolution's Purpose was Holmes Ralston, who is he's known as the father of environmental ethics. Beginning in the 80s, there were many existentialists and others who were argued against the reality of values, like values were just human subjective preferences. There wasn't any real value in the universe. But sensitive thinkers could tell there was something wrong with those arguments because nature has value before humans come along. And indeed, if we want to be environmentalists and care about nature, we have to find a way philosophically to give it intrinsic value. That is, nature's not just valuable for its use by humans, nature is sacred and valuable in its own way. So Ralston did a very important piece of work in his book Environmental Ethics that came out in the late 80s, where he sort of breathed value back into the universe and showed how evolution creates value step by step in every layer of emergence. Something more keeps coming from something less. And I knew that Ralston's ideas applied to the integral perspective. It was a book that needed to be written. But Evolution's Purpose in some ways was just a prerequisite to the book which just came out, The Presence of the Infinite, which is, I think, the book that wanted to come out. But Evolution's Purpose needed to come out first because I needed to really ground the science and spend the time in my own development that only occurs when you write a book like that.
Yeah, and that's how logical progressions work, where you're working out your ideas to then come to the next level of your ideas. And we may sit together 5 or 10 years from now and with your new book or a couple books later, and
right.
who knows where your ideas will go. I mean, in that same vein. But so before we go into the Presence of the Infinite, which you're on a book tour now, we're talking in New York where you're going to speak, and you definitely have a message. So with Evolution's Purpose, did you do a lot of speaking out too? Because these are important
Sure.
ideas.
As an author, when Evolution's Purpose came out in 2012, I had a book tour. I made the rounds, and I created some media, and the book was well received. And again, it's not a commercial book, so it's not as if Oprah is going to call me on the show. And it was also a more intellectually challenging book than Integral Consciousness, my previous book. But one of the things that I've come to understand, one of the themes that runs throughout my books, is this idea of the beautiful, the true, and the good as attractors of evolutionary development. That these intrinsic values have a kind of a gravity on consciousness which pulls evolution forward from the inside. And so if truth is truth is not absolute, but it's not relative either. It sort of brings subject and object together in the course of being seen. But it's a practice, like any spiritual practice. The practice of writing these books and reading hundreds of other spiritual philosophy books and going through the inevitable washing machine of creation that's necessary to produce a book like that, I found that I had grown myself, and that led to this ability to write this next book, which I never could have done without the personal development that was prerequisite.
Yeah. So your new book came out September 2015, The Presence of the Infinite, the Spiritual Experience of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness. And as we're talking about, builds on thinking in your prior books, and it takes the integral perspective into new territory and contributes to the emergence of evolutionary spirituality. So we've been talking about it, but let's dig into it now. You want to say more on it?
Sure. Well, the main theme of The Presence of the Infinite is spiritual experience. Sub-themes include spiritual leadership, and plumbing more into the spiritual teachings of evolution and how the spiritual insights that we can read off of the scientific and historical story of evolution can act as a supplement to practically every spiritual path. And it's not a belief system, or evolutionary spirituality is not a spiritual path in its own right, but what it does is it can effectively bring all the other spiritual paths, whether it's Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Judaic, any kind of spiritual path, whether it's a religious path or a personal spiritual path, a path of nature mysticism, for example. All the different lines of development that have been growing through humanity's ascent, from the traditional through the modern to the postmodern, now have an expression at this postmodern or integral level. And evolutionary spirituality is the family of spiritual views or paths that begin to appear at this level. And what characterizes the evolutionary level expression of these spiritual paths is that they're all guided by and informed by the important spiritual teachings that we can now see within the story of evolution. The primary one being that consciousness evolves, and that the evolution of consciousness is in some ways the purpose of the universe and our purpose for being on Earth. So the future of spirituality, which is with if I'm right, and others in this integral space are right, will be integral. It will transcend and include the best of what's come before. And the religion of the future, the spirituality of the future, will be founded on spiritual experience. So evolutionary spirituality, as I argue, expands our hold on what spiritual experience is and how it works, how we can have it more abundantly, how we can use it more effectively in our work in the world to give our gifts. And so in the book, I talk about the spiritual experience from the perspective of evolutionary spirituality, and the most concise way that I can define what spiritual experience is as the presence of the infinite in the finite realm of time. In other words, when we have a spiritual experience in the many ways we can, the finite realm of phenomenal appearances in some ways becomes thin or transparent or diaphanous, and so that the infinite that's upholding the universe from within sort of shines through. And so this can be seen in non-dual experiences of ultimate reality, in theistic experiences of the presence of God, in all kinds of different group spiritual experiences, body-centered spiritual experiences, psychedelic spiritual. I try to describe all the different ways that people can experience spirit. But then I go on to really plumb the depths of the spiritual experience that are available in the intrinsic values of goodness, truth, and beauty, and how, in a sense, these values, when they appear to us in their most sublime or immediate forms, are literally the presence of the infinite in the finite. So, for example, if you think about beauty, if you think about an exceptionally beautiful person or a beautiful scene in nature, the beauty itself is kind of shimmering. It has a sort of a numinous quality. And while it's always possible, perhaps, to make something more beautiful, the beauty itself is the extent to which something's evolution can proceed no further. It's like a little glimmer of perfection. The infinite and perfection are somewhat synonymous. And so understanding that beauty is glimmers of perfection in the phenomenal world, truth is like glimmers of perfection in our mental world, and goodness can be understood as glimmers of perfection in the moral realm of relationships and society. So these are different expressions of the same thing, but they're like rays of the infinite shining into the finite. And what makes them particularly relevant for evolutionary spirituality is the way that the beautiful, the true, and the good are not only ways we can experience spirit, but they're also ways we can bring spirit into the world. In other words, beauty, truth, and goodness are handles on spirit that we can bring into the finite. Whether we are creating something beautiful through music or some image, whether we're writing books, or endeavoring to bring more truth into the universe in the many ways that can happen through science or philosophy or spirituality, whether we're working to serve and make the world a better place. As the Indian guru named Kareli Baba says, if you want to grow spiritually, serve someone, love someone. And the beautiful, the true, and the good are the ways that we can literally serve and give. And so in the book, I describe how this idea, this conceptual cathedral of the beautiful, the true, and the good, it's like a diamond with many facets, right? And the facets reflect each other, but I sort of go through how they're both useful instrumentally, but also how they're ends in themselves intrinsically. So, when we plumb the depths of these intrinsic values, as I argue, we can actually experience them as messages of love, from the source of the universe. And they provide both instructions for making the world a better place. They're like, how can we make the world more evolved? Well, we can make it more beautiful, more true, and more good. So they're directions of evolution. And if they appear to us, for example, beauty is in a sense a concept or term that is like the capstone value for an entire aesthetic dimension of value experience. All the pleasure and delight that we can experience in the world, in some ways the message that we're getting from that experience is feel loved. Beauty makes us feel loved. Likewise, in the realm of truth, or the rational dimension of value, we recognize that the universe is intelligible, that somehow this crazy universe can be described physically with elegant mathematical formulas. And we can come to know the truth step by step. As humans, the way is open for seekers, and then as we become more acquainted with what's true, as we grow in truth, we become more real in the process. So I think the message of truth as a message of spirit is grow. And then finally in the realm of goodness, or the moral realm of human relationships, I think the message there is love others. So feel loved, grow, love others. These are messages of the spirit that we can understand and work with through this philosophical concept of the great attractor of the beautiful, the true, and the good.
Right, and not tied in with any one tradition, but that the infinite is everywhere.
Sure. Well, the idea, spirit is certainly more than infinity.
Yeah.
And in the book, I say I'm not just talking about a quantitative infinity. I'm also talking about a qualitative infinity. But different traditions take this idea of spirit as infinite and take it in different directions, right? So the Buddhist traditions or the contemplative traditions talk about it in terms of non-duality, right? The theistic traditions of the Abrahamic religions talk about it in terms of a loving creator. But regardless, the idea of the presence of the infinite is pluralistically open, but at the same time says something. It's not just so vague as to be inclusive of everyone without actually making an important truth point about what spirit is and what it's like to have the experience of it.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you to define the difference between progressive spirituality and evolutionary spirituality, but you just said that
Well, yeah, I mean, like all new forms of emergence, whether it's in the physical realm of evolution or the realm of consciousness and culture, at the very beginning it's hard to tell the something more from the something less. So there are many teachers and writers within the progressive spiritual world space who are using the term evolutionary, and I think that's appropriate, understandable. It's okay. It's not a piece of intellectual property. It's more an aspiration to go beyond the limitations of progressive spirituality. After close to 50 years, progressive spirituality has been promising, a great awakening. The last one that they sort of trumpeted was 2012. Nothing particularly significant happened. So this idea that we're all going to just wake up magically is a kind of magical thinking that is one of the shortcomings of progressive spirituality. So evolutionary spirituality attempts to push off against progressive spirituality, against its shortcomings, against its pseudoscience and its magical thinking and its intense commercialism and its lack of being self-critical. You know, some of the strengths of progressive spirituality is that it's welcoming, inclusive, and pluralistic, and that's a very important strength. But the flip side of that very strength is anything goes relativism, right? Where we're not really in, because all paths are honored and included. The idea that some paths are more true than others isn't really something that the culture of progressive spirituality is able to take on very well for, again, appropriate reasons within the cultural task that it's serving within history. But from an evolutionary perspective, truth is a direction of evolution. So all truth, in a sense, points to greater truth, which means that all truth is partial, right? That all truth has a partiality. I mean, the fact that it's usable by humans means that it's necessarily partial. So in the partiality, this is our point of departure. So the ways in which progressive spirituality has failed to achieve a kind of spiritual renaissance or provide spiritual leadership for the developed world, even though it's a significant demographic and it's been influential, it's still not taken seriously by the mainstream media, by the education establishment, by academia, and while, again, the way evolution works is by pushing off against what came before, but now we can move from the antithesis to the synthesis. Now we can, I think through evolutionary spirituality, begin to re-include some of the very important accomplishments of secular spirituality and religious spirituality without going back to relativism. And again, we can recognize a vertical dimension of which way is up without being ethnocentric or chauvinistic. We're trying to include, but we're trying to transcend. And ultimately, the degree of our transcendence will be determined by the scope of our inclusion. So this opportunity to go beyond progressive spirituality, part of it involves better integrating science and better integrating the important spiritual heritage of Western civilization, which is one of the things that evolutionary spirituality attempts to do, and one of the things I attempt to do in the presence of the infinite.
Yeah. So what are some of the goals of writing this book and speaking out?
Sure. Well, to make a contribution to the emergence of evolutionary spirituality. Like I said, I've been identified with and working within the culture of progressive spirituality now for 40 years. And I'm disappointed in it, even though I still identify with it, and most of my friends are still in this culture. I think that we have a duty in our generation to try to provide more inclusive, truer forms of spiritual leadership. And I think that this kind of spiritual leadership is not necessarily the charismatic, guruship. It's more a matter of a movement that better integrates science and spirituality, and in that way provides a kind of form of spirituality that's more agreeable, that people can relate to, that doesn't seem as countercultural, that seems more solid, but yet at the same time more authentically spiritual. And whether or not evolutionary spirituality can fulfill these lofty goals is yet to be seen. But I think that this human spirituality in general will continue to evolve, and it'll continue to evolve by steps. And I've bet my life on the fact that this next emergent step in the evolution of human spirituality will involve incorporating these deep truths of evolution, the spiritual teachings of evolution, and that these truths can lead us into a more transcendent and inclusive form of spiritual culture.
Yeah, and it really is emerging, growing at a level where people are grasping it. So the last chapter of your book is called "Towards a Method of Evolving Consciousness."
Glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, what would you say would be the relationship between evolving consciousness, evolving culture, because we're going to talk about your institute, and creating a better world?
Sure.
Because for you, those themes seem to be intermingled.
Right. Well, as I carefully argue in Evolution's Purpose, evolution is making things better, although there's regressions and setbacks, and things could always go wrong. We start with hydrogen gas, the debris of the Big Bang, and something more keeps coming from something less for the last close to 14 billion years. So I do believe that as we have now come to embody evolution, both physically and psychologically, as we as humans are agents of evolution, the course of evolution is now within our hands. It's no longer natural selection, it's actual selection, right? Evolution in consciousness and culture doesn't proceed inexorably. The world only gets better when people try to make it better. And sometimes when they try to make it better, they make it worse. So, we've got to learn from history and see, this winding course of development that we've been on. But I think that because we embody evolution's structure, we also embody evolution's purpose, in the sense that we can feel the purpose that arises in life, the purpose to survive and reproduce. We share that with our animal cousins. And we can also feel how this purpose also within human consciousness emerges to strive for greater values than just surviving and reproducing. We're striving to make the world a better place. We're improving the human condition. And throughout history, the most dramatic events of improvement have occurred when people improve their definition of improvement itself, right? So that's what we're trying to do, is improve the definition of improvement itself by describing a wider and more inclusive spectrum of values, right? So we're trying to make the world better by making it more beautiful, more true, and more good. And that those values, greater goodness makes people in greater harmony, more truth solves problems, greater beauty makes the world more lovely and beautiful in every way. So this is a tangible, practical way we can think about how we can make the world a better place. These values are not absolute, as I mentioned, but they're not merely subjective either. They're directions. So seeing them as trajectories of growth that we're now called to participate in gives us a take on how consciousness evolves, and how consciousness evolves along with culture. In other words, individual humans can certainly have epiphanies and breakthroughs and develop significantly, but ultimately a person's consciousness can only evolve so far, because, as I argue, the evolution of consciousness depends on giving your gift to the world. In other words, it's not just about sitting in a cave and meditating, it's about making things better. As Jesus says, by their fruits you shall know them. And so the spiritual fruits that we bear, right, the creations of the beautiful, the true, and the good that we bring into the world, these are like the rungs of the ladder of our ascent, right? So even if we may evolve our consciousness significantly, we've got to have a connection to the culture in which we're part of, because that evolution of individual consciousness has to be grounded in a larger culture, right? So when particular individuals make breakthroughs, this helps raise the center of gravity of the entire culture to which they belong. And so, and likewise, when culture makes a breakthrough and there's an emergent new form of culture, then individuals can raise their own consciousness by participating in that, right? So just like as children, as they grow up, they recapitulate the stages of history, from tribal to magical to mythic to rational, and that process of recapitulating the stages of cultural evolution within one's consciousness, loosely, roughly, continues into adulthood for those who are seeking their own form of self-actualization, as Maslow described it. So culture and consciousness co-evolve together, and ultimately the consciousness of any one human can only evolve so far before they're tethered to their culture in ways that force them to give back and help bring others forward with them.
Yeah. So in between your second book and third book, you started the Institute for Cultural Evolution, kind of putting, so to speak, figuratively speaking, your money where your mouth is, because you wanted to put yourself out there into the world with an institute, and you in starting this institute, you delved into the political arena too. So I'm wondering if you could say more about the Institute for Cultural Evolution and its mission.
Sure. Well, in my 15 years of working in this integral or evolutionary perspective, the two areas where I think it sheds the most light or can do the most immediate good is in the realms of spirituality and politics, right? So these books have been mostly focused on spirituality, but the political side of things was ripe for an application of integral thinking. And myself and my colleagues, Carter Phipps and Elizabeth DeBold, back in 2012, we realized that we, in a sense, had a duty to try to bring the light of this integral perspective to bear on political problems. And the major problem of our time, of course, is climate change. So we started working on a paper, kind of a campaign plan, a think tank-based campaign plan, to try to describe how we could make a movement in society towards greater political will to combat climate change. And we had a unique contribution there. After working on climate change as a focus of the think tank for about a year, we realized that in some ways there was an underlying problem, which is even more foundational to the task of building political will to combat global warming, and that was political polarization itself, right? In the United States, hyper-partisan polarization has kind of frozen the government. It's made it very dysfunctional. So we started applying our integral ideas in 2013 to a campaign to help ameliorate political polarization. And that led in 2014 to a paper, Depolarizing the American Mind, a significant conference of modernist luminaries which we held at Esalen on the Big Sur coast. We made a lot of headway there, influencing the influencers and making a lot of good connections. Many of the people who came to the conclave were very impressed by the integral perspective. Public intellectuals like Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Righteous Mind, loved our paper, and we spent a lot of time telling him about integral thinking, and he was very intrigued by the idea. We've carried on that thinking. We've had support. John Mackey of Whole Foods joined our board. Jeff Salzman of the Daily Evolver program has been a big supporter and board member. And so this think tank, this 501c3 nonprofit organization, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, has been gaining ground. We just received a significant grant from Democracy Fund, which is a Washington-based philanthropy, and we've taken this this work on political polarization one step further by seeing how meeting in the middle, while bipartisan compromise is good where you can get it. We saw we had the most traction by describing what a more evolved left and a more evolved right, how they would look. And ideally, a more evolved left and right are an integrally informed left form of politics and right form of politics, and the polarity of liberal conservative keeps reappearing. We have a stuck version of the polarity at the moment, but the idea is that through the evolution of consciousness and culture, the polarity can reappear, but at a much more evolved and more functional form, so that there'll still be people who are inherently conservative, but they won't be traditionalists, right? So describing what a more evolved right and a more evolved left looks like in the context of this integral perspective is the work of the current think tank. And so we've been holding conclaves on the future of the right and the future of the left, bringing together luminaries to think about what an integral expression of these political philosophies would look like, and how each has moral strengths that can be brought to bear to make our political system more functional in ways that can help us deal with the urgent problems we face in the 21st century, climate change being the number one problem.
Yeah. So do you see a thread that connects the ideas you present in your book, The Presence of the Infinite, with the Institute for Cultural Evolution?
Yes.
Because as you say in the book, it's more spiritual oriented.
Right.
So anyway.
Well, so the final chapter of the book, called, as you mentioned, Toward a Method for Evolving Consciousness, starts from the premise that every major historically significant worldview has made its advance in history primarily by having a really important method that was a distillation of its values and its perspective. So traditional consciousness first emerges probably 5,000 years ago with writing. Right? This method of writing allowed civilization to be consolidated beyond tribal boundaries, right? Beyond blood kin. All those who were part of the same religion could be drawn within the circle of moral consideration. And writing did this by establishing scripture, law, and history, all things that are indispensable for a traditional form of civilization. Likewise, with the emergence of modernism, we see the scientific method as the distillation of its values, of its perspective, that really brings huge improvements to the human condition, right? Scientific medicine has improved the human condition immensely. So if this evolutionary perspective really is comparable to these other major stages of history, then this predicts that it too will have a very important method that can improve the human condition in unprecedented ways. So I argue that this method will be a gentle way of cultivating emergence, gently persuading people to expand the scope of what they're able to value. And this will effectively be a method for evolving consciousness. And part of the premise is that almost any problem we can identify is at least partially a problem of consciousness.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? So if we had a method for evolving consciousness in areas where those forms of evolution could produce improvements in the human condition, then we'd have, in a sense, a method for the second enlightenment, something that could be as immensely powerful as a scientific method. So in the chapter 8, the final chapter, I begin to explore the premises that point to the possibility of a method. I mean, it's going to take more than a single author to really discover and bring this kind of method to bear on the problems that we face. But the fact that we actually could, I mean, maybe approach is a better word than method. I mean, it's not a step-by-step procedure like the scientific method, but it does involve the idea that spiritual experience itself is what raises consciousness, especially when spiritual experience is understood to include the beautiful, the true, and the good. So if we look at history, right, works of transformative culture that caused people to move from one stage of consciousness to another, right, were works of beauty, truth, and goodness, right? If we think about Tom Paine's Common Sense, right, during the American Revolution, that gave a political consciousness of modernism to the pre-modern population of the United States in ways that really triggered the evolution, right? Triggered the revolution. Likewise, we can maybe point to Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changin'. You know, that song, as being part of the 60s genre, really made people feel that there was a new way of thinking, a new stage of culture that they could be part of, right? It kind of drew people, the beauty and truth of that song drew people in to postmodernism, right? And so the idea that works of transformative culture that are perfectly in tune with the zeitgeist of their time, that can work on the existential problems that each stage has but that can't be solved at the stage that created it, as Einstein famously said, that problems can be only solved at another level of thinking than the one that created them. So these are some of the premises that I explore, and we're adopting these premises and using them within this Institute for Cultural Evolution by focusing on, we're not spending a lot of time trying to educate people about the integral perspective. We're just showing how the integral perspective can shed light on problems like polarization in ways that people haven't considered before. And this idea of a more evolved right, I mean, ideally a more evolved right and a more evolved left is one in which consciousness is expanded. The best way I can describe this analogy of political evolution is to point to the ways in which our society's ideals of masculinity and femininity have evolved since the 1950s. Like in the 50s, the masculinity and femininity were highly polarized, right? You had John Wayne or June Cleaver, right, in terms of what our ideals were. But since then, we've evolved, and certainly what it means to be a real woman means including being strong and independent. What it means to be a real man includes being emotional and sensitive, right? While there's nothing wrong with androgyny, meeting in the middle, right, it does eliminate the procreative tension. But the idea that that conservative thinking and progressive thinking can evolve in ways that incorporates a little bit of the strengths of the other side while still maintaining their essential essence is an analogy for what we're trying to do in the political realm.
Yeah, in Taoism they teach the harmony of opposites. So basically, that's what you're attempting. So that's a great a major undertaking because the crises of our time, climate change, and all the others. They're paralyzed to be dealt with because of this one reason, the hyper partisanship, the polarization, and it seems like they come from the clash of worldviews. The right wing, generally conservative, is holding on to that traditional worldview and is threatened by change, and the left wing is more that progressive postmodern worldview, and so. To see them evolve and find that common ground without being middle of the road where
right, we don't want to eliminate the procreative tension, but in these dialectical tensions between the major worldviews, these culture war issues, that's actually where the energy of transcendence can be found, right? So we're actually, instead of seeing the conflict as necessarily, a bad thing to be lamented, we're seeing it as an opportunity. So that's the way evolution works. First, there's differentiation, and that allows for a higher level of integration. And so for the last 50 years, this counterculture worldview has been pushing off against the establishment, right, for evolutionarily healthy reasons. And now it's allowed us take the next step of reintegrating, as I mentioned, in the spiritual realm. We can do the same thing in the political realm without regressing, right? And so if we want environmental activists, for example, to be more effective in their building political will and raising consciousness about the environment, doing that from an integral center of gravity rather than a postmodern center of gravity is more synthetic. You can find more people to agree with you because you're not threatening them at the very level of their identity. And that's what many of these culture war problems do, is they polarize people around identity and loyalty when ultimately we all have the same identity. So expanding people's values in a way that allows them to identify with the other is part of the method.
And do you believe or feel or see that there are political leaders in our present time who may play a role or fit into this evolving?
Sure. I get asked this a lot, like where are integral leaders? And there are some in the integral movement who think Obama is an integral leader. I don't agree. I support Obama, but I think he's a modernist in terms of his level, and it's beyond the scope of our talk here to go into that. We could also point to Jerry Brown as, in some ways, the integral in his own way. But we also on the right might point to Rand Paul as someone who, again, I don't think there are any national politicians who have an integral center of gravity. So I need to be careful about this because, my friends give me a hard time. And they say, well, if you can't point to anybody, then how are you going to make political progress? And we're hoping to advance in the culture the vision of a more evolved right and a more evolved left in a way that can attract political leaders to identify with those positions. So describing these positions and making them largely visible to the media and to the political culture is part of the role of the think tank. It's worth mentioning that part of what engaged myself and my colleagues to found this think tank was that beginning in around 2009, think tanks, newly created think tanks funded by the Tea Party, made major progress in trying to debunk climate change, right? Right after the recession, the support for climate change in national polls dropped by 20 points. The most radical drop in support. Now, some of that's recovered, but the fact that as well documented in the PBS frontline program Climate of Doubt, which you can see online, these small think tanks had a huge effect on American politics, and we thought, well, if they can, pull political will down for climate change, a think tank like ours might be able to, reverse that trend. And that's kind of what made us think, perhaps naively, but glad we did, because we're on our way at this point as an organization that we could actually create something that would make a difference in American politics.
Yeah, and you mentioned on your website that there was a recent article in the National Journal, The War on Partisanship, and you and the Institute for Cultural Evolution were given special attention in the article for your work in doing it. So obviously
that's the second piece of national media that we've got, and that helps a lot because you can point to that at least and say, here's one way you can measure success, is how influential you're being within the mainstream modernist media. And if people want to read that article, they can go to my website or the Institute for Cultural Evolution's website, which is culturalevolution.org, which is where all the headquarters for the work of the think tank.
Yeah, your website is Steve McIntosh.
SteveMcIntosh.com.
Yeah. So, and then another campaign that the Institute for Cultural Evolution is doing is reforming Islam. So,
well, I mean, now after the Charlie Hebdo attacks at the beginning of 2015, I felt compelled to just take a stab at describing an integral perspective on the problem of radical Islamism. And, it's not something that we can claim significant traction on. The paper was read fairly widely. We did get some great comments from Muslims. Some people objected. It's a dicey area. About almost anything you can say can be disputed. But as I argued in the paper, one of the ways that people in the West can help Islam as a civilization evolve into a more modernist, global-friendly version of itself is by coming to appreciate the spiritual truths of Islam itself.
Right,
learning
it's a very
to love
devout,
Islam.
it's a very devout religion.
Right, and as a line of development, I think it will eventually grow into the modern, postmodern, and postmodern levels of development. But for reasons I explain in the paper, Fostering Evolution in Islamic Culture, it's called, there are unique things about Islam which give it important strengths, but important ways in which it's not as compatible with modernity as Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism have been. It's had a harder time integrating, but I think the fact that it's more of a holdout, it resists secularization, that's a demonstration of its strength, and we can use that very strength within Islam, its resistance to modernity, to help it make a contribution to modernity and beyond.
And it's great. It's important that you're writing these papers, putting these ideas out there, reforming Islam, reforming our political polarization, reforming capitalism, all these different things that are really so much polarization.
We're trying to add our voice to it, and the lights have been green, so far in ways that are almost spooky, so we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah. So what is your vision for the direction you see yourself taking your work?
Right. Well, I want to continue in the realms of spirituality and politics. I'd like to continue to be a proponent of evolutionary spirituality in whatever way that unfolds. I have to kind of wait for guidance from the universe in terms of where the Tao wants to flow there. I may write another book or more, but I haven't started on that. And I have a variety of books that I could write to try to make a further contribution to evolutionary spirituality, but a little too early to talk about that. In 2016, I'm going to be focused primarily on continuing to build the Institute for Cultural Evolution. Here at the beginning of the emergence of this integral perspective, it needs institutions, and perhaps a few of the institutions that are formed at the beginning will become, major institutions in the future that will outlive its founders. So, by grace, if we continue to make a contribution, then we'll continue to see the vitality of the organization and the resources that it needs to continue will flow to it.
Yeah, that's great. Perhaps your next book will be this continued integration of integral spirituality, cultural evolution, and the work you're doing in the political, social realm. Only you will know.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll have to kind of listen to Spirit, see what it wants.
So Steve, you mentioned your websites, but again, if people want to learn more about your work, what would be the best way?
Well, the headquarters for my work is stevemcintosh.com. And MC is the spelling.
Like the apple.
Yeah. And that has a whole bunch of different videos. I'll put this video up there with your permission. And lots of interviews and excerpts from the book. The website, the content on the website serves as a kind of a free workshop on the integral perspective. So people can go there and learn a lot about it, at least from my take on it. So that's where I would direct people, is to stevemcintosh.com.
Okay, and the Institute for Cultural Evolution has its own website.
culturalevolution.org.
Okay.
Yeah, and
great.
That's the political and we don't hide the fact that we're motivated by evolutionary spirituality, but we want the Cultural Evolution website to be welcoming to everyone, even those who don't have a spiritual perspective. So while my author work and my political work are not completely separated, I try to maintain them as two legs of the progress.
And both websites have a wealth of information and great work on it. So thank you, Steve. It's great work that you're doing, and I wish you many more years of continued carrying forward.
Again, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Okay, all right.